All right, so let's get going. Welcome everyone to our eight-part webcast series. This is part of what we're calling our HR professional webcast series. We also have an executive series that is going to be starting next week that we'll talk a little bit about as we go along. Really excited about this. Obviously, this is a busy time of year for us here at Work Institute. So this week we'll be launching our ninth annual retention report. This report has become the go-to resource in the US for all things employee retention, including reporting why people leave. And the great thing about our retention report is that we have a very, very large data set. In fact, I think it was almost 15,000 exit interviews that we were analyzing this year to present our findings in the retention report. So it's very comprehensive, very detailed, and really is a great tool for those of you that are looking at retention, thinking about it, and trying to think strategically about it. So really excited and hope everybody will be on the lookout for the retention report as it comes out this week. So uh, in thinking about this webcast, and the first thing I want to point out is, we're trying to make kind of a shift from sort of a traditional webinar to what we're calling webcast. I've actually looked at the definition. I don't know that there's a great difference, but to some extent, trying to make this more conversational um, and make it a little more informal. Webinars sometimes feel a little stuffy, feel like a lecture, and trying to make this a little less formal. As we go through the eight-part series, I'm actually going to have some guests that are going to be joining me that have specific expertise around some topics. So I'm really excited about that. So those will be very much conversations between myself and a guest. But as we kick off this webcast, we wanted to start with just the broader state of employee retention and talking about strategic employee retention. And I think what we're talking about right now, and certainly what I'm seeing in the market, is we're almost looking at really turnover prevention. How do we keep people from leaving in the future? If anybody's been looking at the data that's coming out from, say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we have seen some downturn in overall employee turnover over the last, say, 6 or 8 months. It has been going down. But we've also seen the overall number of jobs that are available are also kind of stagnant right now. And typically what happens is as those jobs become more readily available, it oftentimes does drive turnover. Of course, we also had an election year last year, and I think that created a lot of uncertainty. But what we're hearing and we're seeing it ourselves, but we're also hearing it from other research, is that employees are wanting to leave, that they actually are looking for opportunities. They're not necessarily excited about where they are. They're not excited about their current work or their current company. And so they're wanting to leave. And I think Gallup came out with some research that said this is the highest point it's been in like 10 years in terms of their research. So something like half the US labor market is looking to leave in the next 12 months. So when we typically think about employee retention and turnover, we're typically thinking about solving the fact that people are leaving at a rapid rate. And right now, I think we have to be thinking about it slightly different in that we really need to be looking at what are those risk factors that are causing people to want to leave when the opportunity presents itself. So it's going to change the way I talk about this a little bit as we go along and thinking about it, slightly different. But I think that's just where we are as a country right now. I think that's where we are as a labor force right now. And so we're going to think about it that way. I'm also trying to try and think about this in pretty simple terms, right? I think one of the things that companies do is when there is high turnover when there is this sense of or there's pent up turnover or people are thinking about leaving, it feels overwhelming. It feels complicated. Um, and to some degree, there are complicated aspects of it. I certainly get that. But at the same time, it can be simple. It can be put into simple buckets. And so I think about it in three ways, right? So first is the voice of the employee. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about that. But what are employees telling us? What are we learning from listening to employees about what's going on related to why they may be at risk of leaving or why they may have left? And then it's all about acting on those insights. And we're going to talk about how we think about the action part of a retention strategy and how it differs from other things that we might do. And then lastly, it's just how do we hold leadership accountable? And we're going to get into a little bit about what's going on with managers and leaders and talk about that a little bit more. But before we even go there, I always like to start, and anybody here that has heard me speak before or been on some of our webinars in the past, you'll know that we always start with thinking about how much is it costing us? How much is turnover costing us? And so I'm sure a lot of you have seen what I'm showing on my screen right now, but it's our very simple calculation of turnover. So the example here is a kind of a mid-sized company, 1,000 employees. We've got 15% turnover, so we've got about got 150 people a year leaving. I just picked simple math, so an average salary of around 45,000. Although right now the average salary in the U.S. is pushing around 57, 58,000. We always use 33% of base pay as the cost of turnover or base wages. This has been something that the Work Institute has stood firm on for years. It's a very conservative number. I understand that. But we look at that as it relates to overall turnover and what is the average cost of that turnover. So there are jobs that are going to be one or two times their salary. There are some that are going to be lower, but this is where the average lands. And we've done multiple sort of meta research works to really look at what those costs are and feel really confident that that 33% number is a good number. So if we have 150 people a year leaving at 15K apiece, we have $1.5 million in cost of turnover. And generally, we think about that as being everything from the actual cost, whether it's recruiters or advertising or background checks or drug screens or all those things that cost real dollars, to also the productivity losses, the knowledge loss, right? How much time does it take for managers to do interviews? How much time have we lost because somebody else is having to do two jobs and we're losing productivity? So those are all things that are included in that 33%. So also throw in kind of those direct costs, because those direct costs are really the hard costs. They're dollars that could drop to the bottom line. And so we're looking at this, conservative example here of $500,000. So that's important to me because this also changes the conversation from being about turnover to being about a business problem, right? That's costing us money. And when we talk about the voice of the employee here in a minute, I'm going to also talk about how do we look at the risk of turnover and the cost related to the risk of turnover. But this also gives us money that we can invest and actually invest in things that we know are going to retain employees more effectively. So let's talk about the voice of the employee. And I've turned things around a little bit because generally when I talk about the voice of the employee and I'm talking about retention, the first thing I start with is exit interviews, right? Because exit interviews are going to inform us why people are leaving. In this case, I actually want to talk about stay interviews first, because again, what we're hearing is that people are wanting to leave, that there's pent up turnover. So the stay interview is actually an opportunity for us to get ahead of things and actually find out more about why employees are at risk. Now, the whole concept of the stay interview started back in like 2010, I guess it was. A guy by the name of Dick Finnegan really started this whole craze of the stay interview when he wrote a book called The Power of the Stay Interview. It's a very good book. He's actually had a couple of revisions that have come out over the years, but it's really good. And the premise of Dick's book was we needed to start creating conversations between the manager or the supervisor and their employee. And we needed to create that conversation very much about, is someone thinking about leaving? Being very direct and being very transparent about, what does somebody like about the job? What does somebody not like about the job? What are they thinking about directionally where their career is going? And do they think about leaving? And if so, why are they thinking about leaving? So it was a very productive conversation. And I still, to this day, feel like if we can have a good, productive conversation between a manager and an employee, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, I think what's happening though is there's been a big push to have things like weekly one-on-ones. There's been a push, obviously we're still having, in some cases, performance reviews, and those performance reviews are happening maybe on an annual basis, maybe they're happening more regularly. And then all of a sudden we throw this concept of the stay interview into the mix. And one, we're asking our managers to do even more. So what is that one additional thing that we're asking them to do? But oftentimes we're not actually getting to the root cause of why somebody's leaving. More often than not, the manager is reluctant to bring up that topic, to bring up those conversations and to really delve into it. And some of that's because we don't train them very well on how to do the stay interview. But it's a difficult conversation, right? It's tough, and also puts the employee in sometimes a difficult spot, because maybe the manager and some of the things they're doing or not doing are actually why the employee is thinking about leaving or are at risk of leaving. So back in 2013, 2014, Work Institute became what we believe the first company to actually start outsourcing uh, stay interviews. We had a very large Fortune 100 company that we had been working with, and they said, hey, we really like this concept of the stay interview, but we'd actually like a third party to do it. And so this concept of the external stay interview has actually picked up steam over the years, and more companies are doing it. Although most of the companies are doing it through some sort of a online survey called a stay survey of some sort. They're not actual interviews, and we're one of the few companies out there that's actually conducting an in-depth, quantitative, qualitative, behavioral interview as part of our stay interview program. Um, a couple of strengths around that. And again, I want to start by saying, or say it again, I love the idea of a manager and an employee having a great stay interview conversation if it's done well. Um, but I'm starting to see strengths of the fact that if you have a third party doing those stay interviews, I think we get into more detail. Typically, we're doing this on a larger scale. So we actually collect this data into a system where we can actually look at larger trends that might be going on in the organization. So there's reasons to outsource this, because we can actually see more detailed data. The data typically is a little bit better organized. And then we can also see those broader trends that might be going on in the organization. Whereas when the managers are all having these individual conversations, we typically don't see that data collected together and look at it across the organization. But one of the big things that we have to do is to ask, is someone considering leaving, and what time frame are they considering leaving? And then if they're considering leaving within the next year, why are they considering leaving? And getting those specific things that are causing employees to be at risk. Going back to the cost of turnover, we actually then, in our stay interviews, we actually calculate the risk of turnover. So what are those costs that or what is the risk, or the cost risk? I'll get it out here in a minute, sorry. And we can actually quantify what those risks are in terms of dollars. So I think that's really, really important from a stay interview perspective, is that we look at what is at risk, and what is it going to cost us if these people leave. Then, of course, we do have our traditional exit interview. And the one thing I'm always talking about with exit interviews is that we misunderstand what an exit interview is. And The reason is because we're always saying, well, we want to know why people leave. And that is absolutely correct. But the reason we want to know why people leave is that it is actually a predictive analytic as to why people are going to leave in the future. We've seen this over and over and over again. If we actually act on why people are leaving, we actually will drive turnover down, and we'll actually see that we can move reasons for leaving from things like preventable reasons to less preventable reasons. So I always talk about exit interviews not as a postmortem, which is what I hear more often than not, but as a predictive analytic. Why do we do that? Because they predict why people are going to leave in the future. Now, I think one of the big trends that I've been seeing over the last 2 to 3 years is that as companies have moved to more of a continuous listening type idea, and there's all these tools out there, survey tools that are touted as being continuous listening tools, I'm seeing the exit interview in some ways being devalued because we decide instead of actually doing a real exit interview, kind of an in-person or over the phone conversation about why somebody's leave, we're just sending out a survey. And that survey has got significant limitations. It's often sent out before the person leaves, and the research tells us over and over and over and over again that we should be doing exit interviews after people leave because they're going to be more honest and more authentic in their responses. So I think we're actually hurting ourselves in devaluing that exit interview because again, it seems like something that's just thrown into the mix in our broader listening strategy that is being devalued. And yet I can't think of a single analytic that's more valuable than understanding the real reasons why people leave. And so I would urge you to be thinking about how you're doing your exit interviews. Uh, one of the big things is to make them qualitative. And you say, well, why is that? And I always say that because letting somebody put in their own words why they're leaving is so critical because more often than not in a survey, we just have a list of things as terms of, hey, choose one of these. And people just choose, multiple things and they're not really being their authentic self about why they're leaving and what's causing them. So that behavioral interview becomes so important. And that's the qualitative element of it. So we have to be doing stay interviews right now. I think they're vitally critical to be able to understand are people at risk of leaving. We need to be continuing to do those exit interviews and understand why people are leaving because they're predictive of why people are going to leave in the future. And then lastly is the onboarding interview. And that to me, this is those sort of from a retention standpoint, those three pillars of the voice of the employee. And I'm not saying that pulse surveys aren't important. Certainly we have our annual survey, whether we call it an engagement survey or whatever, culture assessment, whatever the term you want to use. Those are also important. But when I'm looking at retention and how we attack retention, it's really these three areas. And onboarding is important because like 40% of all turnover happens in the first year. So it's vital that we get off to the right start and that we onboard people effectively and we don't create risk factors as they're coming on board. So we know that we're onboarding people effectively, that they're engaging in the company early, that they're trained well, that they feel part of the social fabric or the cultural fabric of the company. So all of those things are absolutely critical. Again, internal is fine. I think external provides those additional strengths in terms of sometimes we do surveys, but I think there's a good point where we can actually do an interview to see if we can uncover any of those risk factors as well. So I strongly encourage both stay, exit, and onboarding in thinking about your overall retention strategy and your retention approach. And that will really kind of get the voice of the employee working. And don't let this data just sit on a shelf. It's got to be visible. It's got to be accessible. We've got to be looking at it on a routine basis. And that's where we start talking about acting on the insights. So the first thing I would say in terms of acting on insights is that we have to have those key metrics. So what is our overall turnover? What is our voluntary turnover? What's our involuntary turnover? And what's that first year turnover? Because generally in organizations, what I see is that we have pockets of the organization that tend to have higher turnover than others. Whether that's a key role in the organization, whether it's a location, whether it's a department. And so going back to sometimes I think we overcomplicate retention is that we look at it on an enterprise basis and think, oh, this is going to be really difficult, right? I've got 22, 23% turnover. How am I going to solve this organizationally to improve retention? And it really comes down to being able to find where are those pockets of turnover that are occurring, and then how do we go sort of remediate that in a very focused way uh, in that part of the organization. And I'll talk a little more about that in a couple of minutes. So then we start to bring this voice of the employee data together with the key metrics, right? So what are those risks of quitting? What are the reasons for leaving? Did we have any remediation or development from the overall employee experience that we need to get? And we talk about that in terms of our core drivers, right? So we talk about the company as an employer, the job itself, the team or the people someone works with, and their manager. So what is that overall employee experience in both the stay and the exit process? And what are some of those remediation opportunities as well? We just worked with a client here recently where communication is a big part of it. So that is a critical element as well. But we've got to know what are those risks and what are those reasons for leaving. That really is the cornerstone of what we're talking about. Then we've got to figure out, like, we have to act on the data. And this is where I feel like companies just struggle with this. And I kind of get it to some degree as a former HR professional. But on the other hand, again, we're overcomplicating things. If we know there's an area that has a retention challenge, let's just say it's a plant that we've got multiple plants in our manufacturing company. We have one plant where turnover is much higher. Let's go focus on that plant. Let's not try and deal with this on an enterprise basis, but let's go there. Then let's look at what is the overall turnover. What portion of it is voluntary? What's involuntary? Let's make sure let's go in and do stay interviews. Let's pull up our exit data. And then we develop a 90-day action plan to say what things do we need to put in place based on the data that we've gathered in order to start to affect positively the retention in that location. That's the key to it, right? And you manage those action plans just like you would a project. So we've got check-ins, we're checking with progress. We want to make sure that it's having the intended effect that we wanted it to have. So we very much treat it just like a project. And we make sure that we're communicating to employees. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What are some of the key things that we're trying to remediate or fix in this particular plant or location? Those are all critical because that way employees start to see that the company wants to make changes, that they want to improve the retention in that organization. So those three things are the critical elements. And I can't talk about the project management enough. How do we make sure that what we intend to do actually gets done? We see this over and over again. I saw it in HR my entire career. You see it in so many organizations when we're trying to make changes. It starts off with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of bang, and then it just peters out over time. The project management aspect of this will actually keep it on track and make sure we work through to conclusion the things that we wanted to change or the things that we wanted to put in place. And this is actually one of the areas where Work Institute comes into play often, is that we can step in as that project management arm and definitely keep things going because typically we're getting paid to do that, right? So it stays on track. We make sure that we're getting things done that we need to get done in order to improve retention. So we have to act on the data. We have to act on the information that we're gathering. Get the right information through the voice of the employee, act on that data in a very responsible way, and in a way that we know is going to make changes in the organization. Lastly, we want to talk about managers as a linchpin. And by the way, let me pause here for a minute. Questions from anybody? I'd love for some questions to be thrown in the chat. I've got a Q&A here. I should have looked at this earlier. Let me see. Will the slides of the recording be available? The recording will be available, and then we'll talk at the end about a resource that's going to be available to everybody outside of the slide. So that's one of the Q&As that came up. Please throw other questions in the chat. So anybody that has a chat question, please put that in. So lastly, I want to talk about managers as the linchpin. Okay, so what we have found over the years, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, is that managers really are the linchpin to retention. It's what's going to make the biggest impact. Is how effective are our managers in general, but specifically on addressing and doing the things that are necessary in order to address what's going on that are causing people to leave. Through our research over the years, we've seen that manager effectiveness is predictive of 6 of the 11 categories for quitting. So we know how broadly they impact things, not just their own behavior, but other elements of why people leave, around career issues, around culture issues, around work-life balance issues. All of those things are impacted by manager effectiveness. One of the big concerns right now with this manager, with managers being the linchpin, is that there is a ton of research coming out right now that says that the role of the manager is being overwhelmed, that the responsibilities post-pandemic had possibly increased by as much as 50%, that we just keep loading our managers up with more and more responsibilities. And most of those responsibilities are not leading people or managing people. They're actually other other things like, managing projects or managing other things, a lot of individual contributor work that they're doing. So we've got to make sure that we're actually giving them training and development, but we're also monitoring how much responsibility are we putting on our managers. I saw one other question. What instruments or practical solutions can we offer to managers to facilitate the impact you're describing? I think the practical solution is in training and development. One of the things that we see is that we typically are training new managers, and then the development stops. And one of the things that we encourage is that managers should be learning together on a continuous basis, whether that's monthly, quarterly, quarterly at least, should be being developed, whether that's around crucial conversations, whether that's around communications, whether that's around how do we do career coaching, how does that, all of the things that are necessary, we should be having our managers learn together. And then specifically bringing in that stay interview and that exit interview data into those conversations to help them to understand how does that data apply to what they're learning, and also the practical ideas as to how they're going to go out and make changes or improve things in order to have retention be improved in the organization. So I think it's really comes down to training and development, but it's not a one-time thing. It's all the time. But managers also need to be held accountable. And again, more often than not, when we go into organizations that have high turnover and we ask, do managers have a goal or a KPI related to retention? The answer is no, they don't. We have to make sure that we're holding managers accountable to making sure that they're responsible and accountable to improving retention, whether that's improving it by 3%, 5%, 10%, whether that's a specific target number that needs to be there. Managers have to be held accountable. But you don't just hold somebody accountable and then not develop them and train them and help them, right? So those are the elements that we have to have, is they have to feel like they're being supported in that effort to improve retention. Okay. So managers are the linchpin. We have to be communicating effectively with our managers. We have to support our managers. We got to make sure that they're not feeling overwhelmed, that we've actually giving them the right tools to improve in their organization, and that they're not just burnt out and stressed over the role. So again, I want to encourage everyone to throw some questions up there. Again, we're about 30 minutes in. I wanted these to last about 30 to 35 minutes. So I want to talk a little bit about next steps and Q&A. Again, throw those questions out there. I'm going to be monitoring. It looks like a new one just came in. John says, I think managers are the linchpin is key for so many organizations. I frequently observe that managers are told that they are accountable for their team's turnover, but they are not equipped to positively drive this. I often say that we give them the keys to the car, but don't teach them how to drive, and they blame them for the wreck that they see. John, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's exactly right, in that we are giving them a car, but we're not teaching them how to drive that car. So that is critical. So a couple of next steps. So one, assess the voice of the employee. Are your stay interviews working? If you're not doing them, how do you want to do them? I think now is an absolute critical time to be doing those stay interviews. If you're doing exit interviews, are those exit interviews working? Are we getting high response rates? Are we getting the type of data that we want? Is it contextual? Again, I'm going to challenge you to think about that exit interview differently than everything else you're doing. I don't think just throwing a survey out there is working very well for most organizations. So I would argue that we need to be rethinking that. So what are those gaps? Are the gaps in how we're developing our managers? Are our gaps in how we're collecting the voice of the employee? Are there gaps in metrics that we're actually creating or related to our employee turnover? And are those being effective? And then, of course, we have to be developing our managers and holding them accountable to it. Questions. I want to see a few more come in out there. So again, I want to talk about this series. So this is an 8-part series. This is number 1. We're kind of broken it up into a couple of buckets. One is considered kind of the executive series. The topics are a little more targeted towards executives. One is an HR professional series. Of course, anybody can come to any of them. We're not going to be checking IDs at the time that you join. So I'd love to have everyone on. Again, be on the lookout for our retention report being launched this week. I want to take just a couple of minutes and turn it over to Catherine Barron, who works in our business development team, and have her talk a little bit about a resource that we're going to be following up with that might be helpful to you. So Catherine.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, as Danny said today, I'm Catherine. It's nice to meet you all. I am the workforce development specialist at Work Institute. And as Danny said today, workforce and retention challenges make or break a business. At Work Institute, we help companies understand the labor market and their business by assessing why employees stay and leave, what drives engagement and productivity, and gaps in development and leadership. So we've got an awesome resource that we prepared following this call, Pillars of Employee Retention. Meet with me to get your copy of the Pillars of Retention, this retention resource, and let's chat about the state of your workforce as well. I'll turn it back over to Danny, but I'll be sending you an email by tomorrow at the latest with the copy of this recording, as well as how to get your hands on that resource. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Catherine. Lastly, if you want to sign up for next week's webcast, is uncontrolled turnover a fiduciary breach? This is a really, really important topic right now. I think even though turnover is declining, I think we don't look at turnover under the cost lens. So I obviously started this webinar or webcast with talking about the cost of turnover. We're going to dig a lot deeper into it next week and talk about it as a fiduciary responsibility. So I really hope that some of you will join us next week as well. Um, I hope this has been helpful. I look for your feedback. Again, my name is Danny Nelms. I probably should have done an introduction at the beginning, right? Just started talking. Danny Nelms, I'm the CEO at Work Institute. I've been here for coming up on 15 years. Prior to that, I was an HR leader, so I really understand where you're at and some of the challenges that you're having. So if you want to talk to me, you can find me here at Work Institute. You can find me on LinkedIn. Danny Nelms at workinstitute.com. All my contact is on my LinkedIn profile, so I encourage you to go there and you can figure out how to get in touch with me. Certainly, if there's something Work Institute can do to help you in any of these efforts, I'm sure Catherine would love to hear from you as well. Stay tuned for more webcasts that are coming down the road. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to pause just one more minute for any last minute questions. But I don't see any. So I'm gonna let everybody go. Have a great, great week, everyone. Stay warm if you're in the southeast. It's getting cold. Oh, we got one more. Oh, just a thank you. Beth, thank you as well for joining us. Talk to you all soon. Thank you so much.